Good afternoon. This is Dr. Fran O'Connor. I'm the Medical Director for the Consortium for Health and Military Performance up at Uniformed Services University. And I'm going to be talking about what the military cadre leader needs to know when dealing with exertional collapse in warfighters today. I have nothing to disclose other than I am a former colonel in the United States Army Medical Department. I am a member of the Department of Defense working at Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. Specifically, I'm going to be reviewing the principles of exertional collapse as they pertain to prevention. I'm going to identify common etiologies of collapse in warfighters and specifically pay attention to the 5 items you see below: exertional sudden cardiac death, exertional heat stroke, exertional collapse with sickle cell trait, exercise-associated hyponatremia, and exertional rhabdomyolysis. So let's first talk about some of the principles of prevention when dealing with exertional collapse. The classic schema used to identify prevention is primary, secondary, and tertiary. With primary prevention, that is designed to keep the disease process from becoming established by eliminating or causing increasing resistance. Classic example would be the use of immunization to prevent something like flu. Secondary prevention would be interrupting or detecting the disease before it becomes symptomatic. Example here would be going into the physician's office and having your blood pressure taken to identify hypertension before it becomes a problem. And then finally, tertiary prevention is limiting the consequences of symptomatic disease. This would be going to the emergency room with chest pain, getting a cardiac intervention like a stent or an angioplasty to prevent the progression of a heart attack to further cardiac injury. Okay, we're going to start with our first case here. This is Wes Leonard, basketball player, unfortunately died March 3rd, 2011. As you see here, he made the shot, and then the game was over. He was the hero of the game where everyone rushed the court. He got in the team lineup where everyone went to shake hands with the opposing basketball team, and he suddenly started walking and collapsed to the ground. Unfortunately, Wes Leonard collapsed as a result of a sudden cardiac arrest. And he had an underlying cardiac condition known as dilated cardiomyopathy, previously asymptomatic. When we take a look at the epidemiology of sudden death in young athletes, it's fortunately a rather uncommon event. When it does happen, it's devastating to a community. When it happens to a national star like Reggie Lewis, it makes the front page of the paper. When you take a look at young athletes on the whole, the risk is about 1 in 50,000 to 1 in 100,000 per year. So that's going to mean about 20 to 30 young athletes every year are going to have a sudden death event. Obviously, the risk range gets older or gets increased as we get into older athletes. Sudden cardiac arrest is thought to be the leading cause of exertional death in young athletes. Now, further into the epidemiology of exertional sudden death, we know that the male athletes appear to be 5 times at greater risk than the female athletes. Many of these conditions mature in collegiate athletes such that collegiate athletes are at higher risk than high school athletes. That's about 2 times higher. Could be the greater stress or, again, the maturity of a lot of these congenital abnormalities. Non-cardiac deaths account for 22% of the deaths. The great majority of these non-cardiac deaths are going to be from things like exertional heat stroke. For reasons we don't understand, football and basketball account for the majority of sudden death, and African Americans appear to be at greater risk, again, for reasons we don't understand. Now, this is a classic study by Dr. Barry Marion. He's a cardiologist in Minneapolis, quite some renowned, has spent a career looking at sudden cardiac death. And when you look at this slide, you take a look at 1,866 cardiac deaths. The great majority of these are a cardiovascular origin. And you look at that 56%, the great majority of these are exertional. And when you further go down and take a look at the exertional etiologies, most of these are going to be congenital problems like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy on the far left, coronary anomalies, myocarditis, arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy. Again, most of these are going to be inherited disorders. This was published in 2009 and has been the classic teaching, and why we go to great detail to do a history and a physical examination on young athletes and warfighters. Now, in 2015, Dr. Kim Harmon, who you see on the far right up in Seattle, took a look at the NCAA cohort and found a couple of interesting things. Number one, when you look at the second bullet She found that the most common cause of death in NCAA athletes was not hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but rather sudden unexplained death, or autopsy-negative sudden unexplained death, which is quite disturbing that we don't know exactly why these young athletes are dying. She also disturbingly found that Division I male basketball athletes had an incidence of sudden cardiac death of 1 in 5,200. As you remember, the risk rate for the entire cohort was about 1 in 50,000 per year. So Division I male college basketball players seem to have the highest risk. Now, a military cardiologist by the name of Rob Eckhart performed a similar study, and this was published in 2011 in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. And what you note here again from Dr. Eckhart is that the leading cause under the age of 35 for sudden cardiac death in warfighters was unexplained. So this is very congruent with the data from the NCAA that sudden unexplained death, autopsy negative, is the leading cause of sudden death in young athletes and warfighters, meaning we really don't have a good understanding of why many of these young people die. So for primary prevention, we have 3 strategies, and this comes from the Korey Stringer Institute, Dr. Casa, published in the Journal of Athletic Training in 2013. First strategy is universal precautions, and that is we try to protect all athletes up front as well as warfighters, and we know this very well in the military. Exercise acclimatization, meaning that we try not to crush athletes and warfighters the first day. We want to gradually introduce exercises. Environmental acclimatization, again, taking the time, the first 10 to 14 days to acclimatize to the heat. We want to adjust the workload with hydration and workload adjustments. Many of us are familiar with this diagram you see in the lower right on work, rest, and water consumption tables, that depending on the workload and the flag that's indicated for the temperature and the humidity will adjust the amount of hydration and the work-rest cycle. Presence of a certified athletic trainer is recommended by the NCAA. You see this in the military, that many units are adopting having a certified athletic trainer help to guide practice or to be present. The surrogate, of course, for this is going to be Cadre, trained Cadre who are going to be out observing, watching, and guiding training. And then finally, a certified strength and conditioning coach is the recommendation in the NCAA, that you have someone who is actually developing the programs to make sure that they are prudent and trying to leverage issues like exercise acclimatization and environmental acclimatization to move slowly and surely in exercise progression. As far as secondary prevention, we're looking for occult disease. We're looking for some of those things that Dr. Marin identified in his study. So we do careful pre-participation examination. Certainly everybody is screened at a MEP station before they enter the military. There is consideration for secondary screening outside of a stethoscope with things like electrocardiography, echocardiography, and specialty consultation, but that's all based upon what the screening examination shows. So in terms of physicians, nurse practitioners, physician's assistants performing the cardiovascular pre-participation examination, we have standards that we follow across the country. Now, many of you may think this is the way it's done in the military, this was the way it was done years ago, but this is currently not what is done. The standard of care across the country is this PPE, or Pre-Participation Physical Evaluation monograph. It's in its 5th edition. It's used across the country for NCAA as well as high school screening. It's endorsed by all the major organizations, as you can see here on the left, that provide care to athletes across the country. And these standards are adhered to in the United States military. There are certain guidelines that we follow. This comes from the PPE manual that you just saw. They're all endorsed by the American Heart Association, and there's 14 elements of the American Heart Association recommendations that we follow when we perform these exams, whether they're for a young athlete or at a MEP station, looking at a careful medical history for things like chest pain, unexplained passing out with exercise, high blood pressure, etc. Reviewing the family history, if there's anybody in the family under the age of 50 who had a problem with dying early before the age of 50, if there's an underlying inherited disorder. These are all conditions that are screened for in MEP stations. and a physical examination. Simple things, 4 simple things: looking for a heart murmur, palpating femoral pulses to exclude aortic coarctation, which is a disorder of the aorta as it exits the heart, looking for the physical stigmata of Marfan syndrome. You see these on the right, looking for people who have unusually long fingers, abnormalities of their chest wall or their back. Marked limb distortion, as you can see in this picture here with someone with extremely long limbs, or marked flat feet. These are all simple things that we do, in addition to getting a blood pressure, to identify who might need secondary screening. Now, the NCAA also issued guidance in 2016 as this became an issue, and it really endorsed everything you see in that PPE number 5 in the American Heart Association recommendations. This is a picture of Dr. Brian Hainline, who's the chief medical officer of the NCAA currently. But the most important thing is that special tests like echocardiograms and electrocardiography are not mandated, and they're only indicated by clinical suspicion by the provider. And that's a standard that's adhered to right now in the United States Department. Now, one of the most important things that's become clear with recent evidence is that not all athletes and warfighters carry the same risk. Therefore, not everybody needs necessarily the same strategy. People with higher risk might need a different strategy. As we pointed out, collegiate basketball players in Division I appear to have higher risk. So these 2 bullets on the right are the current thoughts in the United States right now, that the differential risk of sudden cardiac arrest between athletes and non-athletes is not completely fully understood at this point in time, and that athletes do display a differential risk, men over women, basketball players over non-basketball players, African Americans versus Caucasian. So these risks may be differentially small, but they're real, and they need to be understood by the provider who's clearing the athlete or the warfighter. This is one slide that just takes a look at some of these relative risks. You see down on the bottom, the risk for a high school athlete in Minnesota. The risk is relatively small. You see that slide on the left, sudden cardiac deaths per 100,000 going from 5 to 15. So these absolute risks are still relatively small, but you're going to see here in just a second that the relative risks can be dramatically different. So if we start from the Minnesota athlete, age 12 to 31, with an absolute risk less than 5, but collegiate male athletes are somewhat higher. Male college athletes even higher than that. U.S. military male athletes about comparable to male college athletes. African American college athletes somewhat higher. Again, still, if you take a look at absolute risk, not dramatically different. But when you get into male college basketball athletes, and then all the way up to African American or black male college athletes, you're now approaching a somewhat greater relative risk. We talked about that risk in NCAA Division I being 1 in 5,000 when you've got a baseline risk of 1 in 50,000. So you start to see that the relative risk is greater, absolute risk still relatively small. But this differential risk has caught the attention of physicians in the United States, that if there is a differential risk, we might want to think about a differential strategy on how we screen, but still very controversial in 2020. The sad reality is no matter what we do, because the absolute risk is relatively small, screening is a challenge. So this is just one study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2018. English football cardiac screening was done on young athletes. You see here the average age of 16. You had a cohort of nearly, 11,168 athletes were screened. They got a history, they got a physical exam, they got an electrocardiogram as well as an echocardiogram. They followed them over time, and what they found, unfortunately, is that they had a total of 8 deaths despite all this excellent screening. And the sad reality is the bullet that I have highlighted there, that 6 of the 8 athletes who died with sudden cardiac death had normal cardiac screening results, meaning a normal history and physical, a normal electrocardiogram, and a normal echocardiogram, meaning that this is really tough stuff when we try to screen. Tertiary prevention is obviously man is down. How can we save a life? This includes bystander CPR, that people who observe this are ready, willing, and able. Technically, they have the skills that they can start cardiopulmonary resuscitation. We want to have access to an AED. As you see here on the slide, someone goes down. The most important thing is electricity as soon as possible. And third bullet here is execution of the emergency action plan. That there is a plan. If someone goes down, be it an athlete or a recruit or someone doing a PT test, we know where the AED is, it's well rehearsed, we know what to do so that we can hopefully save. So having a plan that has been practiced is absolutely critical. This is one of the plans that we use at the Marine Corps Marathon up in Washington, D.C. But again, thinking it through, having practiced it, having rehearsed, being able to assess responsiveness, having early access to an AED, and someone who knows how to do CPR so that we can jump on it and obviously do our best to try to save a life. Now, what you're going to see here is an example of a sudden cardiac arrest. This is the sad death of Hank Gathers, who was a very talented basketball player. Most important point I want you to observe when you see this sudden cardiac death is that Mr. Gathers is going to go down quickly, almost like a face plant with a syncope or passing out with exercise. He's going to go bolt upright as he comes out of the arrhythmia, and then he's going to go back down. He's going to start to seize. When you start to see anything like this, to include seizure activity, should always make you think that there's a sudden cardiac event or a cardiac etiology taking place. So here we see, again, basketball game. Hank Gathers was the top rebounder and scorer in the country at the time of this collapse. And you're going to see him get a dunk here in just a second. And there he is. There's Hank Gathers. Again, the most talented basketball player in the country at the time. He's going to walk over here. The camera's going to be watching him, and you are going to see him collapse with a sudden cardiac arrest. This is going to become important as we see collapses further on through this educational video. So down he goes rather quickly. When you see that abrupt kind of collapse, that should make you think cardiac. Now, he's going to come up quickly because that arrhythmia that took him down is going to quickly abate just by chance at this particular time. But unfortunately, he's going to quickly go back down with the recurrence of this arrhythmia. So you see him go down here again. He's down, and now he's starting to have some seizure activity. These seizure activity should prompt you to think, again, of a cardiac arrest. And unfortunately, Mr. Gathers succumbs. So, with tertiary prevention, we need to be prepared. We need to have an emergency action plan. We need to have an AED. Here you see a picture of a medic. This is up at Newport, who actually is with a unit that is training. He has an AED and to stand by in case during this recruit training, this is an officer recruit training at Newport, that he's ready to go. and put this into action. Next case, Korey Stringer, football player, 2001. This sad death unfortunately led to the founding of the Korey Stringer Institute up at the University of Connecticut that's dedicated to preventing exertional sudden death. This is a picture of Korey Stringer actually the day before he died as he was starting Minnesota Vikings practice. This was a picture in the USA Today, but it was the next day that he had a collapse from exertional heat stroke. So he's working out on a Tuesday, full gear, hottest day of the year. In the Midwest, heat index was 110. He had vomited 3 times in practice, walked into an air-conditioned shelter. There he was complaining of dizziness, weakness, heavy breathing ensued, and unfortunately he died of an exertional heat stroke. Now, heat stroke is a very common problem in the United States military, and as you see here from this Medical Surveillance Monthly Report, the number of heat strokes is actually climbing, as well as the number of heat exhaustions in the U.S. Armed Forces. Whether or not this is increasing heat load, lack of acclimatization, fitness of recruits coming in, we know heat, despite our prevention efforts, continues to be problematic. In 2017, there were actually 464 recorded exertional events. Now, exertional heat stroke, not only common in the military, it's a terrible problem across the country, in particular in football players. This is one publication in 2013 demonstrating that since 1995, 54 football player fatalities. The great majority of these were in high school. When you take a look at some of the rates of exertional heat illness, to include heat exhaustion and heat stroke in football, down that bottom bullet, 4.42 per 100,000 athlete exposures, 11 times that greater than any other sport combined. You take a look at the third bullet, and we clearly know that most of these are predictable. They are occurring in August. Almost a third occurred more than 2 hours into the practice session. So again, highest heat load, long duration, this is when athletes are going to get into trouble. Exertional heat stroke is arguably the most common cause of preventable non-traumatic exertional sudden death in American sports. Heat injury, heat exhaustion, heat stroke can and will occur, but in 2020, we should have good strategies to prevent sudden death at this point in time. Now, the Israelis have done a yeoman's work in looking at exertional heat stroke. This is just one publication in 2004. And what they found in looking at their soldiers, there were 2 items that were present in almost all of fatal cases of exertional heat stroke. Number one, the physical effort was unmatched to the physical fitness. Rather predictable that some people just were not in shape to handle that load. And number 2 is the absence of proper medical triage, the absence of recognition that this person was in trouble and doing the right thing by getting them to cold water immersion. Now, there are many risk factors that we see for exertional heat stroke, and I've got a number of them listed here. I just want to highlight those that I have emboldened for you. Poor physical fitness is obviously a risk factor. We know that those people who have the highest VO2 maxes, the fastest 2-mile runs, tend to have a lower risk for heat stroke than those who are slower and unfit. Lack of acclimatization, people who are coming into an area of heat that they are not acclimatized to. Obesity is a powerful risk factor. Illness, people who have underlying infection, whether that's a flu-like illness or a diarrheal illness, can be problematic. Those using medications, supplements that have ephedra or amphetamine-like products, and use of heavy equipment or clothing. So we know again that fitness is a major problem, or lack of fitness coming into the military. We certainly know that we subject warfighters to tremendous loads with equipment, which can be problematic. Football players have their own loads as well, in particular helmets, pads that limit their ability to get heat radiating out to the environment. Obesity, this is a study done by Dr. Cheryl Bedna, who's currently down at Fort Bragg, but she published this in 2010, and I think it's a powerful statement. Obese and overweight men were 3 times more likely to sustain any heat illness than non-obese men during the first 90 days of service. Coming in overweight or obese, that's someone who's at risk. Obviously a major risk factor as well for high school or collegiate. Now, medications also can play a role here. And you've got a whole list of medications here on the left: anticholinergics, antihistamines, tricyclics, stimulants, diuretics, antipsychotics, ACE inhibitors, and beta blockers. All these medications can affect either your ability to sweat, your ability to produce a good cardiac output or VO2 max. They may affect your ability to vasodilate in your skin. They may affect your ability to have a good circulating volume, or with things like antipsychotics and stimulants, they may affect your brain that you don't recognize when you're in trouble, and you will keep going despite the fact that you're in trouble. Now, supplements. I can't overemphasize this enough, that supplements, in particular pre-workout supplements, can be problematic. Many of these have sympathomimetic properties where people will just continue to push because they're not feeling the strain. This is a slide here of one soldier who collapsed and died in Afghanistan. This was taken out of his locker. And as we all know, dealing with warfighters, it's not uncommon. People do not take one supplement, they take many supplements. God knows what combination or what may have contributed to the collapse, but this is what was pulled out, again, of just one soldier. Now, in terms of primary prevention, there are many things we do. We've already talked about the work, rest, and water consumption table. This is designed to leverage modifications according to what the heat category is. We leverage acclimatization, again, taking time to build up some resilience to the heat load. You see a sailor up top who's taking a look at the wet bulb globe temperature to, again, modify the training. Other things we can do, you'll see on the left, but in particular, we can leverage pre and intra-event cooling to try to mitigate the risk. Here's a better look at the work, rest, water consumption table. This comes out of U.S. Army Public Health Command and the United States Army Institute of Environmental Medicine. Again, looking at what is the workload, what's the heat category, how can we modify the work-rest cycle, how do we adjust the water intake so that we can protect warfighters from getting hurt. This is something you should all be familiar with. Now, the National Athletic Trainers Association also has published guidelines for high school and collegiate sports, trying to mitigate those 54 deaths we've already talked about, but in particular, leveraging those first 5 to 10 days, trying to make sure that coaches don't crush kids on the first day, limiting to one practice per day, making sure those early practices don't exceed 3 hours a day. Remember, over 2 hours led to problems with death, leveraging walkthroughs, etc. But just being prudent up front, trying to mitigate the risk of sudden death from heat stroke in these. Now, there are many strategies, pre and intra-event cooling strategies that can be used. You see here a warfighter in a Humvee who's using a hand device to leverage cooling or heat dumping. Chilling things like slush can help to keep people cool and actually have been shown to improve marching distance over the long term in many armies. And there's a lot of interest in microclimate cooling clothing that's being developed for future needs. But anything like this to leverage pre and intra-event cooling can make it. To start or not to start, this always becomes a very key question when you're going to do a Burn the General run or a 5K. We need to know what's going on in our local environment. Is this an unusual heat event day? And maybe it's prudent not to run the event. This was published by Dr. Bill Roberts, who takes care of the marathon up in Minneapolis. And he published a determining a do not start temperature for the marathon based on adverse outcomes, trying to know what is the local temperature, what's the local humidity that would prompt you to say this may be a mass casualty event and maybe not a good idea to start an event. So it's published for the lay literature, but these are things we need to think about as well in the military when you've got an unexpectedly hot day where people aren't acclimatized, where it might be prudent not to push on that particular day. Secondary prevention, this is where we leverage things like the buddy system, trying to detect mild forms of illness where people are watching. Obviously, if you are a company commander or a platoon sergeant, trying to identify what unit, what squad, what platoon, what company is showing signs of stress where cases are jumping out because perhaps they're not adhering to work, rest, hydration cycles, or pushing too hard. These sentinel cases can be very important for a leader to be aware of. Screening for poor food and fluid intake. And again, as you see here, this football player down on the right using this hand cooling device, but leveraging the concept of heat. Now, heat dumping is something that the military actually developed as a secondary prevention strategy. This is any opportunity to dump heat to the environment where someone might be mildly heat exhausted, might have that temperature that's starting to creep up, but if we can intervene with a secondary prevention strategy, we hopefully can prevent the conversion to an exertional heat stroke or heat exhaustion collapse. So cool showers, as you see here on the right. Making sure that the dormitories where either athletes or warfighters are sleeping, that the air conditioning is functioning. So at night, we're not accumulating heat, but actually dumping heat to the environment. These arm immersion cooling systems, many of you should be familiar. This is just a picture of myself and a command sergeant major down at Fort Jackson, leveraging our arms in an arm immersion cooling system. These are also at Fort Benning, Support Ranger School, and you'll see them throughout the Department of Defense. Ice sheets are a very important strategy as well. And I'm going to show you a video here. This again is a strategy that someone has collapsed. Early ice sheets can be used to help prevent the conversion to a heat stroke. So let's watch.
Ensure that ice sheets are present at any training event where the commander has assessed risk of heat injury. Apply ice sheets anytime a soldier has a change in their mental status that is likely due to environmental heat exposure. Mental status changes include confusion, inability to properly follow commands, and a loss of consciousness. Keep in mind that mental status changes from heat injury are more important than the soldier's temperature when deciding on the treatment of heat injuries. To determine the mental status of a soldier, ask the following questions. What is your name? What month and year is it? Where are you? What were you doing when you started feeling sick? Follow this procedure. Remove an ice sheet from the ice water at about the same time the soldier's clothing is removed. Spread the sheet out on a litter as the soldier is being lifted from the ground. Lay the soldier on the sheet and wrap it around him. Always cover as much skin as possible, including the top of the head with an additional sheet. Call for evacuation of any soldier who requires cooling with ice sheets to the nearest medical treatment facility or emergency room via EMS. When the sheets become warm, replace them with cold ice sheets and put the warm ones back in the cooler. Repeat this process until EMS arrives. Do not use temperature measurement as the basis for stopping cooling.
Obviously, ice sheets can be extremely helpful, and we want to make sure that Cadre are aware how to use them and that they're out on the environment in the event of a collapse. Tertiary prevention efforts focus on people that have already collapsed, may be well in the throes of a heat stroke, and we want to make sure they don't die, and we're trying to limit morbidity. So rapid cooling interventions by first responders really can make the difference. Here you see down on the bottom what's used for the Marine Corps Marathon. The Navy uses this all over to take care of Marines. It's also used at Lackland Air Force Base, where we have actually a gurney over a kiddie pool of water that's chilled with ice to facilitate cold water immersion, but still protect the ability to put an AED on an individual. These are heat attacks, just like a heart attack. This is a video from the Marine Corps Marathon. You need to be prepared because these can be profound. I want you to pay attention to this individual who is still conscious, unlike the face plan, but you're going to see him completely limp as he's brought to the kiddie pool.
Get away! Watch out, watch out, watch out! Red 14, pulse 90.
Hey, please step back if you're not in it. Step back.
These are a full court press. Flat out, you need a team that knows what they're doing. You need to move quickly, and if you do so, you can save a life. Once again, it's adherence to the emergency action plan that you're prepared to know how to execute. This again is just an algorithm that comes from the Marine Corps Marathon that marches right through how to execute rapid external cooling, when fluids would be indicated, when you stop the cooling. General recommendation is to stop cooling when the temperature is about 102, 102.5, and then to move that patient on. But it really comes down to having a good plan on getting that patient, that warfighter, to emergent cooling. This is what it looks like down at Quantico, where they take care of the officer candidates, and I again want to show you this video of a team in action.
All assignments are pre-established well in advance of any potential incident. Assignments consist of recorder, vital signs automated and manual, IV with blood draw, runner for incidentals, core temperature monitor, provider stationed at the patient's head and is the acting authority on treatment. Optional is an additional 2 active coolers.
Initial temp was 106.5
Expect the patient to be violent. Watch your sharps and maintain positive control of the patient at all times. The first and most important step is to achieve a core temperature as soon as possible.
Take it easy, buddy. Take it easy. You're all right. You're all right.
Roll in high.
You're right.
Initial tip, 107.
Initial temp.
107. High.
Any core temperature above 102, the provider activates active cooling. This consists of ice and bags of ice placed around the core, the neck, groin, armpits, and under the knees, as well as active massaging of the major muscle groups of the thighs towards the core with ice bags.
1428 high.
106.8.
106.8 high.
Take it easy, buddy. You're okay. You're okay, buddy. You're okay. You're okay. Okay. All right. All right. I need you to relax for me, okay? I need you to relax.
So 106.7.
You're all right. You're all right. You're in medical.
106.7 high.
While you were running. It's okay. You're going to be all right, okay? You're going to be okay. Come on, I need you to hold still. I need you to hold still. Okay, I need you to hold still. Sit. Okay? Stay.
Temperature 106.4. Switching to
106.4 high.
Be prepared and be flexible to move to manual reading in the event of machine failure.
6 minutes.
1448. 6 minutes.
Temperature 106.2.
106.2 high.
How you doing over there, always struggling?
Notice that vital signs and temperatures are called out every minute. The recorder calls back all data with the time it is recorded. It is important to maintain constant communication.
We have some vitals yet.
Keep working on it. Temperature 105.8. You're on that.
105.8 high.
Blood pressure 136 over 72.
136 over 72 high.
It is a noisy environment. It is imperative to maintain constant communication and repeat backs.
105.6.
105.6 high.
Respiration's 24.
24 high.
Okay, you're going to be all right. Hold still.
Catheters in.
Catheters in high. 1430.
Temperature 105.4.
105.4 high.
Hold still for him, okay?
Hold still, okay?
Hold still. Hold still. Hold still. What's your name, bud? What's your name? What's your name?
Gonzalez.
Gonzalez? Gonzalez, what's your first name, Gonzalez?
Once the patient is conscious, obtain a patient history including name, demographics, orientation, and any other information the provider deems necessary.
Tell me your birthday.
November 9, 1990.
Okay, tell me where you are. Tell me where you are.
Drawing blood now.
Strong blood high.
An 18-gauge catheter is used. With IV access, green top blood vials containing lithium heparin are used to collect blood for the ISTAT. Ambient air temperature will affect the operation of the iStat, so be flexible and prepared to warm or cool the machine as needed. Collect additional studies as warranted. The runner takes blood to the iStat.
159. Temperature 104.4. 104.4 I. Respiration's 20. Respiration's 20 I.
Patient shivering is an expected response, but active cooling continues until provider determines.
Just get you cooled off, okay? You got too hot. You got too hot. We're just gonna cool you off, okay? Just put it on the case.
Temperature 103.8. 103.8 I.
Let's secure that IV, please.
Obvious KBO. IV KBO 1432. BP 138/78. 138/78 I. Temperature 103.5.
Acknowledge it,
103.5 I.
Hold still for us, buddy. We're just cooling you off. You got
Respiration's 20.
okay?
Respiration's 20 I. Pulse 110. Pulse 110 I. Temperature 103.3. 103.3 I.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last temp for me, please?
Last temp, 103.3.
Turn that down, please.
That recording. iStat available now, sir.
I stand, thank you.
Temperature 103.0.
103.0 I.
Okay, I have a sodium of 141. Sodium's 141.
141.
Okay,
BP
go ahead.
134/76.
134/76 I.
Temperature 102.9.
Okay, IV
102.99.
is now wide open.
IV, wide open, 1433.
Respiration's 20. Respiration's 20 I.
You're gonna be okay, Eric. Eric's gonna be all right.
Heart rate 113.
Relax for me now.
113 pulse.
Temperature 102.7.
102.7 I.
Okay, stop active cooling for a bit. Let's see if it comes down.
Ending active cooling is targeted at 102.0, but it is at the discretion of the medical provider.
102.6.
102.6
The
I.
heat packet is medical legal documentation for retention in patient files. It is important for all notes to be clear, concise, and legible.
102.5.
Temperature 102.5 I.
BP 136/78.
136/78 I.
Continue close observation of core temperature for normal downward trending with the possible spike of core temperature.
102.3 I.
You're all right. It's okay. It's okay. Just take those deep, slow breaths. Slow everything down for us, okay? Be okay. Be okay, okay? All right?
Respiration's 24.
Eric, tell me where
Respiration's
you are.
24 I.
Temperature 102.2.
102.2 I.
Where were you running when you
Pulse,
started?
107.
Where were you
107
started
pulse I.
running? Were you just PTing on your own?
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay, it's okay. Yeah, okay. All right.
Temperature 101.9.
101.9 I.
Take the ice off, guys. All right, bud. Okay. Your temperature's down now. Just need you to relax and bear with us, okay? We're going to get you off of this thing here in just a second.
Temperature
Yes, please. Why don't you go grab a wheelchair?
Temperature 101.8 I.
Ready to take a
Blood
minute.
pressure 136/78.
136/78 I.
Continue to safely monitor the patient for definitive medical care at the medical tent, for further evaluation by medical staff, and to ensure patient status has been updated in the medical database.
Respiration's 24.
Respiration 24 I.
Pulse
Are you in the Navy?
101.8.
101.8 I.
Pulse 102.
What is your rank
Pulse,
and your
aye.
rate? You're in E3 hospital corpsman, okay. You got an ID on him now?
So I'm going to stop that video there, but bottom line up front, it is a full court press. That's a team at Quantico that sees in excess of 100 heat strokes a year. They're well rehearsed. You have a PA or a physician at the top. Everyone else is a medic, and they are a well trained team. Next case, this is Dale Lloyd, football player, collapsed on a field in Texas after overexertion in a practice. His teams had ran 16 consecutive 100-yard sprints, almost a full mile. Early on, he was showing signs of distress, breathing heavily, and complaining that he was having marked pain and tightness in his legs. He could barely stand, and eventually, during one of these sprints, he collapsed to the ground. His death was a sickle cell trait associated death, what we call exercise collapse associated with sickle cell trait, and changed everything such that in the NCAA Division I, II, and III, all athletes are screened for sickle. Now, unfortunately, this has become a major issue in the United States military. What you see here is at Great Lakes training, and there were 2 tragic deaths of 2 sailors in 2019. There have been other sickle cell trait associated deaths in 2019 that have prompted increased attention by the United States military. So let me explain to you what is sickle cell trait and how is it different from sickle cell. Well, red blood cells are critical because red blood cells carry oxygen so that we can do work. They carry oxygen on a molecule that's known as hemoglobin. It's a very complex structure, 4 protein subunits where it's got 2 pairs of 2 different types of globins or proteins. And those proteins, these globins, have heme or iron that's there, and that's all there, again, designed to carry oxygen down to working muscle. Now, a mutation in the beta globin gene as opposed to the alpha chain can result in hemoglobin S or sickle hemoglobin. Sickle cell disease occurs when you have 2 sickle genes that are inherited. Sickle cell trait occurs when you only have 1 sickle cell gene that's inherited. So again, sickle cell disease, you have to have 2 parents, at least both of them have to have sickle cell trait to give you sickle cell disease. And it's only 1 copy that results in sickle cell trait. Now, sickle cell disease, very important. The bottom line up front is my last bullet. If you have sickle cell disease, it's disqualifying for medical condition for military service. And people with sickle cell disease can't come in the United States military. It's an awful disease. It can be very difficult. People generally die prematurely. They can have profound anemia, medical complications. Life expectancy right now in the United States is between 40 to 50 years of age. About 1 in 600, and that's actually 1 in 4,000 Hispanic live births can result in a child with sickle cell disease. What about sickle cell trait? Well, sickle cell trait is rather common. You've got about 3 million people in the United States, and about 300 million people in the world have sickle cell trait. And you see the prevalence rates here. African Americans, about 1 in 10 to 12. Hispanics, 1 in 183. And Caucasians, about 1 in 625. So it affects all races, but obviously African Americans disproportionately 1 in 10, up to 1 in 10 can be carriers of sickle cell trait. Now, interestingly enough, as you see here, 4 in 10 West Africans have sickle cell trait, and there's a reason for this, and it's because of natural selection, because if you have sickle cell trait, it actually can be protective against complications related to malaria. So people with sickle cell trait actually have an advantage against malaria in Africa. But in general, sickle cell trait is considered to be a largely benign, rather common, and it's a benign carrier condition. The single most important thing about sickle cell trait is to know that you have it, because if you were to have a child with someone with sickle cell trait, you carry the risk of having a child or creating a child with sickle cell disease, which obviously can be a very difficult issue. Now, sickle cell disease and sickle cell trait cells under stress will sickle. And you see this demonstrated on the right. Normally the red blood cells are round, they're mobile, they're flexible, but under certain stresses, like local hypoxia or low oxygen tension, acidosis, increased temperature, those circular red blood cells will sickle. And when they sickle, they can become sticky, they become inflexible, and they can lead to downstream clotting. This rate of sickling or polymerization, it's highly dependent on the hemoglobin level that the patient has in their blood, with lower levels of hemoglobin S leading to less cellular damage. And this is an important clinical point for us as people enter the military. Now, this has been an issue in the United States military for some time. Here we see General Dempsey when he was the TRADOC commander, dealing with an issue that in basic training there were 2 soldier deaths associated with sickle cell trait. He actually convened a conference up at Uniformed Services University where we took a look at what we know and what we don't know about sickle cell trait. We convened at that time some of the leading experts in the world with regards to sickle cell trait. Dr. John Kark was a former military hematologist on the left there who did a lot of the work in the 80s on recruits and sickle cell trait, and I'm going to talk about some of that. And we have other leading experts who are in attendance to try to help the military shape policy. Now, very important to know that warfighters with sickle cell trait serve with distinction. We know when in this one study here that was published in MilMed in 2018 that soldiers who are sickle cell trait positive service members deployed more frequently for greater lengths of time and remained in the service longer compared to African American soldiers who were sickle cell trait negative. So sickle cell trait soldiers can serve and do serve with distinction. And in this one particular study, there was no significant differences in crude mortality rates among those who are sickle cell trait positive versus those who are sickle cell trait negative. Now we also know, and this is data that comes from a study taking a look at the Department of Defense enlisted fiscal year 17. When you take a look at all races at all numbers and do some estimates here, there are almost 20,000 enlisted warfighters with sickle cell trait. 20,000. So on top of the study that I just showed you, you've got a large number of people with sickle cell trait that are serving and serving with distinction in the United States military. That being said, the literature is fairly clear that under extremes of stress, that sickle cell trait is associated with sudden death. You see a picture here of 9 young men, football players, all who died and succumbed with exertional sudden death. This was a study published in 2009 that did show that there was evidence for a number of issues that are associated with sickle cell trait, to include blood in the urine, which is known as hematuria, hypoacinuria, that you see here, which is actually the inability to concentrate your urine that might contribute to problems with dehydration, exertional rhabdo or muscle breakdown, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes, and then of course this very unfortunate complication of exercise-related sudden death. So although largely benign, okay, in most people, under extremes, there can be complications. Now, there have been several key publications, one in the military and one in the civilian, that have looked at these risks. And again, I want you to think about absolute risk and relative risk that we discussed early on with sudden cardiac arrest. It's a study by Dr. Kark, who I showed you in the military. Military recruits looking at almost 500,000 military recruits between 77 and 81. And what he found is that African Americans who were sickle cell trait positive had a relative risk of sudden death compared to African Americans who were sickle cell trait negative of 30 times. So the risk, the absolute risk is relatively small of sudden death, but that relative risk is greater. In the civilian sector, again, Dr. Harmon took a look at this and found that very comparable to the military, that if you were an African American sickle cell trait positive, you had nearly 15 times the risk of exertional sudden death compared to African Americans who were sickle cell trait negative. So again, these are relative risks, not absolute risks. But when Dr. Harmon took a look at Division I football players alone, the sickle cell trait African Americans have an absolute risk of 1 in 805 of having a complication, or 37 times relative risk to those without sickle cell trait. So again, comparable to military risks. Now, you got to take a look at the big picture, though, to understand this. We've already taken a look at this slide before, but we're going to revisit it. This is taking a look at what kills young athletes. And again, a cohort of 1,866, cardiovascular being the leading cause. You saw that, over 1,000, most being exertional, with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, coronary anomalies, as you see down in the lower left. But you have to go all the way to the top to that circle. Okay, moving from left to right, and you see 67, which are other miscellaneous deaths. And when we go to the other causes of death in athletes, you start to see 22 suicides, 12 lightning strikes, 8 related rhabdo events that were thought to be sickle cell trait related that led to death. So when you take a look at the big cohort, knowing that the risk in a young athlete is about 1 in 50,000 to 1 in 100,000, sickle cell trait complications are a relatively small contributing factor to what will lead to the demise of a young athlete. So it's important to keep that absolute risk and perspective in mind. And again, go back to my data of 20,000 African Americans who are serving, and the great majority serving without any complication, and actually serving with some distinction. Now, what does it look like? Well, when you take a look at the profile of those people who have died, most of this is from case reports. Most is going to be from unconditioned military recruit or a deconditioned athlete in the preseason. Most. Here you see a picture of a young athlete, the last NCAA athlete. This is Ted Agu, who died at Berkeley during a pre-workout supplement. Most of the time, it's going to be related to repeated intense exercise bouts with limited recovery over a short period of time. This is what you see most commonly in football players. But most of the time, it's going to be some form of heroic event for that particular athlete, whether it's these repeated intense exercise bouts or trying to meet a time on a obstacle course, a 1.5 mile run, a 2-mile run, where that athlete is not necessarily familiar with that or trying to do something heroic to meet a time that they are not normally doing. Now, as opposed to the sudden cardiac collapse we saw with Hank Gathers, it's different and it looks different. It's unusual muscle weakness, pain or cramping, but most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, it's going to be a conscious collapse. So it's going to be this leg weakness that's going to take them down, or back weakness, but they will initially be conscious and talking to you. This is important. Now, questions that are out in the literature include, is it heat, is it hydration, or the intensity that are the main culprits? Now, Dr. John Kark, who published in New England Journal, really felt that it was heat that was the predominant contributing factor. And as I've already pointed out to you, heat can contribute locally to those cells sickling. This is Dr. Philippe Kahns, who's looked at this. He's a hemorrheologist and really believes that the major factor is hydration, that the loss of hydration around these RBCs leads to a lot of these abnormalities, and that if we can maintain hydration, we can limit a lot of these complications. Dr. Randy Eichner, a former team physician for the University of Oklahoma, though, and one of the leading thinkers on sickle cell trait-related collapse in the United States, does not believe the major trigger is heat or hydration, that it is intensity, that it's just doing too much for that individual that we've alluded to before without having proper rest, that is the key variable. Now, at the Uniformed Services University, we're actively involved in studying this issue because we're concerned that we may be mislabeling something, and we don't want to identify everyone who has sickle cell trait with the same risk. So the question up top, who is the warfighter at risk, and can genetic studies assist? We know that the risk of sudden death is about 1 in 3,000 for a sickle cell trait trainee, 1 in 3,000. And again, that risk is 30 times the risk of someone who does not have sickle cell trait. So you've got 1 in 3,000, and be about 1 in 90,000 for recruits in general. But when you look at the 1 in 3,000, it's 1 in 3,000. It's not all 3,000 that are dying. So who is the 1 in 3,000? We believe sickle cell trait has to be reconsidered as a single hemoglobin gene mutation, and that while all subjects with sickle cell trait may be similar for this gene, they may be different for other genes related to hemoglobin or energy, and it's the combination of abnormalities that creates the risk for the 1 in 3,000 and why the other 2,999 may not have a comparable risk. So bottom line up front here is that not all sickle cell trait athletes or not all sickle cell trait warfighters may be the same. That being said, genetics, interesting, it's research, it's forward thinking, and it is years away before we can use genetics to help us make these distinctions. So for primary prevention, the NCAA currently requires, as a result of the death of Dale Lloyd, that everybody is screened and educated on sickle. That being said, there are some people who believe that this is problematic to identify people with sickle cell trait and draw them out. The American Society of Hematology in particular felt that by screening people and identifying people, it has the potential to harm student athletes and the larger community of individuals with sickle cell trait. So this is an area of active controversy, even though the NCAA at this point in time screens everyone and educates everyone, as does the Air Force, as does the Navy. Guidance from the NCAA is as follows, and I'm not going to belabor all this at this point in time, but I'm going to point out two things that I have highlighted for you here as bullets. Number one is felt that athletes with sickle cell trait should set their own pace, and that athletes with sickle cell trait be excused from performance activities such as serial sprints or time-mile runs, especially if they're not normal sport activity for that particular athlete. Other than that, all the other bullets really address all the things that we've talked about before, which is common sense, acclimatization, hydration, building up slowly to exercise tolerance and avoiding vulnerable periods. Primary prevention, also a strong call out in the literature here, again from Dr. Kahns. If you had one thing you had to do with sickle cell trait athletes, it would be to ensure that they are properly hydrated before they begin exercise. Again, this should be ad libitum hydration, drink when you're thirsty, but they should have access to hydration because many believe that this can help normalize blood hyperviscosity and help prevent some of these complications. Secondary prevention, single most important thing is to recognize people who are struggling. That's my call out there. Recognize athletes who are struggling early on so they can immediately be allowed to rest and not push past their physiologic limit. That short rest may make all the difference in the world. Other things we want to try to avoid, this is guidance for the NCAA, punitive exercises or conditioning sessions that are literally there just to punish. And then secondary prevention also includes an emergency action plan to identify what happens next when you identify that person. This is a slide that I put together for you here on education and recognition. And I think this is where it's going for the military and for Cadre, with hopefully the help of the lecture I'm giving you today, to be able to identify what does a heat stroke look like? What does a cardiac collapse look like? What does muscle cramping look like? And of course, I'm going to show you a video here in just a minute. What does an exercise collapse associated with sickle cell trait look like? Some key things I want to point out here, the difference between an ECAST and a cardiac collapse. Cardiac collapse, you saw Hank Gathers, you fall like a rock. Exertional heat stroke, they can be variable, it could be a collapse, but they could be bizarre behavior before that collapse. Muscle cramping, they're hobbling to a halt, whereas in ECAST, they're slumping to the ground, but they're still conscious, at least initially. In an ECAST event, they're weak. Weakness is profound over the pain, but that pain will progress. Cardiac collapse is generally no cramping, and exertional heat stroke, certainly very fuzzy thinking. That distinguishes a heat stroke as that cognitive dysfunction right up front. An ECAST event versus muscle cramping, muscles are generally normal initially, whereas opposed to a muscle cramping, those muscles are all locked up. You may actually see them visibly fasciculating as you look at them. Temperature is generally going to be below 103 in a sickle cell trait event. Obviously, exertional heat stroke, it's going to be 104 plus, non-specific. And the finally bullet, that ECAST event can occur early, and that can occur early in exercise. It doesn't have to be hours in. It can be just several sprints. I'm going to show you a collapse here in a minute with someone who collapses 8 minutes in. Muscle cramping usually occurs later in exercise. Exertional heat stroke usually occurs later in exercise, and a cardiac collapse is limited to no warning whatsoever. Tertiary prevention, you need to be prepared. You got to have an emergency action plan. What are you going to do with someone who collapses? What are you going to do if you know that they're sickle cell trait positive? Cadre should be all over it and recognize, they should know their people, recognize a struggling warfighter, and intervene. Providers need to be educated on all causes of exertion-related collapse, exertion-related death, so that they can intervene with the proper intervention. Now, it is thought, and you see here in the NFL, that oxygen can be value added for those with sickle cell trait, in addition to removing from that. Now, what I'm going to show you here is a video, and this video is of a collapse associated with sickle cell trait. This is a civilian security team that's participating in a competition. They're going to be going actually from Georgia up to Albuquerque, where they are at altitude, but they've been at altitude now for about 7 to 10 days before this individual is going to collapse. So he is reasonably acclimated. The individual you're going to see is going to be participating with the team. It's a competition, and he's going to be involved in running up a hill, shooting at a firing line, going back down a hill to get some different ammunition and a different weapon, then coming back up the hill, where you're going to see him start to struggle and collapse. This is an extremely fit man. He ran a 5:30 mile, always led the pack, was always up front, but on this particular day, he was not, and you're going to see it. The other thing, before you see him running here, and you're going to see him start at about 6 minutes into the exercise, he had to carry a 180-pound body up 5 flights of stairs, but he was well trained to do this. To carry this body, again, being the biggest guy. The man is 6'5", so let's watch this video. So here you see the team running forward. He's going to be the last man on the team here, all the way in the back. Okay, with the gas mask on, he's going to be approaching a shooting line, and he's going to be at the far shooting point, going to have to climb into a box. Now, this is an amateur video watching the entire firing line as they're shooting. Okay. So you're going to see everybody's going to be clear, but they are going to draw their attention that they're going to be able to identify this man at the end is actually struggling. And they weren't used to seeing this because this man is normally at the front of the line and he does not struggle at all. So we're going to watch him, and again, he's going to be the man in the at the tail of the group. We're developing an educational video right now interviewing this man. So here they come back up the hill. They had to run about 300 yards down to an ammo point, and you can't even see him at this point in the video. He's going to be on the far left. He is really starting to struggle. You're now about 8 minutes into exercise for this individual. Cadre member running up to the shooting point. So the team is getting some instructions, but our individual has had his first taking a knee, collapsing, but now the team is up and moving again, coming to the shooting point, and you have Cadre and leadership here trying to encourage the team to keep going. About 8 minutes into exercise, and he is in 9 out of 10 to 10 out of 10 pain with his legs, can barely move, always been a leader, but the team can't shoot unless they all get to the shooting firing line. So with exercise collapse associated with sickle trait, it's large muscles, in particular the legs and the back, that are going to go. And you're going to see here a conscious collapse here in just a second. He's going to go down, but he's still very conscious as to what's going on, but his body, his legs in particular, are failing him. He is sickling in those legs right now. But the team is being encouraged. Nobody can do anything unless he gets to the box. 8-9 minutes into exercise, he can't move. Okay.
Go, he's here, go. All right, fire, load. Take your rifle. Let me have your rifle. Come on, guys, fire.
So in that scenario, the team made it to the box. The team got to fire. The individual fortunately did not die, but he had a terrible exertional rhabdomyolysis event or muscle breakdown, needing surgery on all 4 compartments of his legs to open them up. He suffers from continued leg dysfunction at this point. So what do we need to do? We need to be prepared with an emergency action plan. And in the NCAA and in efforts like you see here, I showed you this before up at Newport, you have a medic who's standing by. He's got his AED for a cardiac collapse, and this device actually has oxygen as well. Oxygen can be administered in the event of a collapse that you just saw associated with sickle cell trait. Next case. It's a sad case that occurred down at Fort Benning about 2-3 years ago. Lieutenant Michael Peros, Warfighter, first day of Ranger School. Fell ill during the first day of Ranger School. He had completed his training. Had been hydrating quite excessively that day, hand-to-hand combat, gone to dinner, and he started to get ill. Was complaining of not feeling well, headache, nausea, etc. He unfortunately died of an exercise-associated hyponatremic event. Now, hyponatremia is a serious problem in the military. Actually, the last several deaths at Fort Benning, not been heat stroke, but have actually been exercise-associated hyponatremia. This is one slide, just taking a look of the number of deaths climbing. This is just through 2009, but it remains a serious problem in the Department of Defense. Not only in the Department of Defense, but this is a young lady, Cindy Lucero, who died at the Boston Marathon. This is a collapse in an athlete or a soldier, normally normothermic, meaning they have a normal temperature, but they have mental status changes, and that can be a headache, that can be confusion, usually associated with, again, overhydration in the absence of putting out that hydration through urine. It's a very complex medical issue, but it's a syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. Most of the time, if you are drinking, you will pee that excess fluid off, but there's an inappropriate presence of antidiuretic hormone. Inappropriately, you will maintain that fluid, lower your sodium, and this can become markedly dangerous, and in some cases, like it was for Michael Peros, like it was for Cindy Lucero, it can be fatal. This is a young lady's death. I happened to be working the Marine Corps Marathon when she died. This is Hillary Bellamy, was 36 years old, who died at the Marine Corps Marathon. Similar type death with overhydration, headache, excessive fluid that led to a hyponatremic death, unfortunately. Now, this is one study that was published in 2003 that took a look at some of these hyponatremic incidents in runners. And what they found here, if you take a look at some of the conclusions here, that excessive fluid consumption, longer finishing times were risk factors. The major finding and the only clinical sign was vomiting. And oftentimes, as we know, if we see an athlete or a soldier vomiting, we'll continue to give them fluid, but that may not be the answer, and vomiting may be your only clue that someone's in trouble with a low sodium level. What do we do for primary prevention? Well, once again, we pay attention to our work, rest, and water consumption tables. This is our best strategy moving forward. In terms of the National Athletic Trainers Association and hydration guidelines, these were updated and published in 2017. People always want to know, how much should I drink? And in general, the recommendation here from this paper was that most fluid problems can be avoided by allowing people to drink to thirst, meaning that the thirst mechanism is generally fairly reliable. If you don't know your exact strategy for an elite athlete, drinking when thirsty is perhaps the best strategy. Now, if you're an elite athlete, on the other hand, that strategy may not be good enough, and you may need an individual strategy, in particular if you're trying to compete at an elite level. But if you don't know your sweat rate, your best strategy, again, to avoid overdrinking is to drink to thirst. The key for this document is that it's very difficult to provide a blanket recommendation for all to an entire cohort, and that it needs to be individualized. So we need to be cautious, in particular in the military, as we try to provide blanket recommendations, general recommendations, but we need to recognize that individuals are different and that drinking to thirst is really perhaps the best. Secondary prevention you see at major races, in particular endurance events like the Ironman or ultra events, that there are weigh-ins along the course, and if people start gaining weight, this is where they're taken out to avoid problems of hyponatremia. You see on the right here, this is an iStat device. We have these at military posts, we have these at major races, that if people are in trouble, we can early on take a look at a blood sample at the point of injury to see if people are hyponatremic and intervene with strategies. This is, again, tertiary prevention. Now you got an athlete who's in trouble, or a Warfighter who's in trouble with hyponatremia. They're vomiting, they have low sodium, and having a plan to intervene is our most important plan at the Marine Corps Marathon, or you'll see in emergency rooms across the enterprise, that if people are identified with low sodium, is that we will intervene with hypertonic saline. And hypertonic saline, you see here on the right, can be used in people who have low sodiums to make a difference and to save a life. Because if we overhydrate with regular fluids, D5W, normal saline, lactated ringers, you can actually lead to their demise. We need hypertonic saline, which has a large amount of sodium in it, to try to prevent a complication. Last case, Doug Brenner, football player. This is at the University of Oregon. He had said to have had a bad exertional rhabdo event. Brenner said the coaches had trash cans lined up for patients to throw up in before they started the practice. After the first day, when people passed out, Brenner said oxygen tanks were brought to the next workout. Couldn't move his arms after that day. My arms were so swollen that I couldn't even take my own shirt off. Couldn't even reach a fork to my face. Obviously a pretty dramatic workout. He had an exertional rhabdomyolysis event. An exertional rhabdomyolysis, although uncommon going on to a sudden death event, can occur. Now, this is a considerable issue of interest to the United States military. A slide put together by the Defense Health Agency, again showing increased prevalence of both exertional rhabdomyolysis and exertional heat illness. These are a direct threat to readiness. If people have a bad rhabdo and they're hospitalized, obviously they. This was one study, just looked at the University of Iowa, where they had people doing 100 squats in a row at an intensity of a 20 rep max, put a large number of these University of Iowa football players in the hospital. The athletic director came out with a comment, a drill that should never be used. We actually took a look at a cohort up at Brockport, which is an ROTC unit. These ROTC cadets were involved in an extreme exercise event They were participating in something known as the MRF, where it's a 1 mile run, 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 squats, followed by another 1 mile run with a weight vest. All these cadets had done this before, and they had all done it successfully before and not had an issue. But on this particular day, the clock was put on these kids, where it now meant that they had to complete it for time, and they were completing for ranking and potentially impacting their ability to commission. As a result, you had a number of people, 31% of the people who were individuals, 13% involved in teams, who were put in the hospital for management of exertional rhabdomyolysis. The interesting thing here was that you had two groups of people who were hospitalized. You had the unfit, who were unprepared, but you also had some of the fittest, people who did not know when to stop and were pushing to get the best times. So the fit were not necessarily protected. But the most important variable here, and the most important takeaway, is that they had all done this before, but when they were pushed to do it novelly against a clock, it became a problem. So there are a lot of factors that contribute to exertional rhabdomyolysis and why people get into trouble. Exercise factor, obviously experience and fitness level. If you've done these things before, it's not a big deal, but when it's novel, or you're under stress to perform, it can be an issue. Intensity obviously is going to be an issue. Duration, type of exercise, eccentric loads, novel loads can be a problem. Non-exercise factors that we need to take into consideration, illness, just like heat stroke, can be an issue. Sickle cell trait can be associated with rhabdomyolysis, again, if it's novel. Throw on high ambient temperatures, add to the issue, just like we discussed before. With heat stroke, drugs, nutraceuticals, supplements, pre-workout supplements, underlying myopathies, these can all be considerations that contribute to a perfect storm where people can get into trouble. Now, this has become a major issue for the NCAA with primary prevention. This was put out in 2018, and I think the most important takeaway here is the identification of vulnerable periods for athletes. And these are people who are new to the program, just returning after an injury or an illness, returning from spring breaks, academic breaks. These are periods when people get into trouble. Coming off a prolonged leave can be a problem, or a long weekend. Hurting people on a Monday can be a problem. Came forward from the NCAA that all strength and conditioning workouts need to be exercise-based. They need to early on have work to rest ratios of 1:4. They need to be documented in writing. And you need a strength and conditioning professional involved in trying to piece together the volume, the intensity, the mode, and the duration as you move forward. So Dr. Hainline, who you saw early on with sickle cell trait, certainly involved here. And again, just these are common sense recommendations, but I think the call out of vulnerability and these vulnerable periods are key to not only the NCAA, but also us in the military. Secondary prevention. Perhaps the most important thing is that rhabdo is no joke. I see an awful lot of rhabdo in our clinic, and the great majority of people get better and do well, but a certain percentage do not recover. And if you go on to injure your kidneys and have an acute kidney injury of severity that requires dialysis, there is a risk for going on to chronic kidney disease. So it is no joke. Your best strategy for secondary prevention, however, is hydration. If you start to get into trouble, this is going to help prevent the complications of severe injury. As far as tertiary prevention, when you've got a bad rhabdo, we have a published guideline. It's available at our Human Performance Resource Center and our CHAMP website at Uniformed Services University. You hopefully want to avoid problems like requiring dialysis. You see a dialysis machine up above, or needing to go to the operating room for a fasciotomy. This is what fasciotomy was required for our sickle cell trait collapse that you saw in our collapse video. Final thought to me, or for me, to you as leaders of Cadre, of Warfighters. Here, in the end, the critical variable is unquestionably, it is leadership. It's people knowing who walk beside them. It's knowing your soldiers, knowing the warfighters who work for you and with you, because you, as a leader, in my estimation, are the most important moving forward. We have published on this. with exertion-related illness. And I know as I'm looking at cohorts of injury related to heat, sudden death, rhabdo, sickle cell trait, leadership and followership are absolutely key variables. Perhaps it's been a privilege talking to you today. I look forward to answering questions as we move forward here. This is going to be my email as well, that you'll be able to contact me for any questions related to this presentation. And again, I look forward to participating in the webinar and answering questions for you. Thank you very much for your attention.